you can see from the title of my talk, this idea of how music and education relate to democracy and what it means to live in a shared world. About a year ago, last week, Maxine Greene died. She was an august inspiration and philosopher for many decades, taught at Teachers College at Columbia, and was particularly in the last, I would say, third of her career, focused on the aesthetic experience and the transformation and transformative possibilities that can come from arts and aesthetic experiences. Maxine Greene was a kind of intellectual mentor to me in starting Community Music Works in Providence. I was graduating from college and knew that I wanted my future to be about playing chamber music professionally, but there was an itch. I didn't know that I wanted to do that in the standard fashion and for the audiences who would typically afford and participate in classical music concerts. At the same time, there was a thread of interest in public service and really trying to repair the world, feel that my efforts professionally were going toward some positive change in the world. And the third piece was thinking about education and the incredible potential for education to be that catalytic change for young people and provide the catalytic opportunity for young people in a democracy to realize their potential. And I read a chapter from a, at that time, recently published book by Maxine Greene that has become a kind of catalyst for me. And she said, "I hope there exists and that I can speak to a community of educators committed to emancipatory pedagogy, particularly in the domain of the arts. I hope there exists and that I can speak to a community of educators committed to emancipatory pedagogy, particularly in the domain of the arts." And I thought, I want to be part of that community that she's going to speak to. Emancipatory pedagogy teaching for freedom. And what kind of freedom did she intend? Well, I think it's the freedom of having voice, having ideas, being free to realize one's full potential, and that these kinds of freedoms are possible through the arts. Intuitively, that made a lot of sense to me. Growing up in music, I knew kind of the personal, the spiritual, the very individual kinds of growth that was made possible for me through my experiences studying music. And this is the kind of growth and education that's not the formal, benchmarked layers of academic success where you progress from one thing to the next, but it's the real profound kind of growth we hope for in education, which is a young person having those personal moments to realize their own identity, to become attached to their own identity and to sort of realize what they can do. So this idea of identifying voice, identifying one's own potential, is a thread. And I think in a democracy, we need people to feel that empowerment individually and have the opportunities to grow. Maxine Greene says, "I argue for aware engagements with the arts for everyone, so that individuals in this democracy will be less likely to confine themselves to the main text, less likely to coincide forever with what they are." Saying, it's not that you should, as a young person, grow into a definition that's already out there. You should grow into a definition that's truly yours. Aware engagements in the arts so that individuals will be less likely to confine themselves, less likely to coincide forever with what they are. How do people develop that individual voice? How do people have the confidence to do it? So let me just skip to the end and tell you my thesis here. And it's this question: can a participation in music give young people a voice to participate fully in society? That's the question. Can our participation in music give young people a voice so they can have full participation? There's traditions, even if we just look back to the last 100 years in this country, traditions of people who have said yes to that. The artist's voice, the artistic voice in this country is critical. It's critical to the health of a democracy. It's critical to the health of our society. John Dewey, who is a great American philosopher, a kind of intellectual predecessor of Maxine Greene, talks about, and you have to go back and read or reread the Art as Experience, the 1934 classic Dewey text, because it sparkles with brilliance, even though the language is a little arcane. Get past that and get to the sparkles. Dewey says that the artist sees truth in ways that no one else can. That the artist's role is to take in all of the data, all of the information, all of the chaos of daily life, and to kind of distill meaning. And more than the scientists or the historians, that creative, imaginative perspective that the artist can bring to the world provides meaning not only in their own lives, but for the lives of people around them who see their work, and in a sense for future generations. So he talks about the Greeks, and he said, what do we really know about the Greeks? What do we know about these ancient societies? We know some things historically, but what we can enter into their thinking, into their the way they lived their lives through the artifacts, plays, architecture, urns, the things that are passed down through the arts. And he says it's also the artists who imagine the future and sort of make new possibilities come into being. He says, only imaginative vision elicits the possibilities that are interwoven within the texture of the actual. The first stirrings of dissatisfaction and the first intimations of a better future are always found in works of art. Change in the climate of the imagination is the precursor of the changes that affect more than the details of life. Only imaginative vision elicits the possibilities that are interwoven within the texture of the actual. I love that, right? If you think of the tapestry of our reality, and to think there's new possibilities interwoven right there. In the same decade, really, that Dewey's work was published, the United States started to experiment with putting these ideas into practice, and that was in the New Deal. Many of you may be familiar with the Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, the Federal Writers Project, that were all part of the WPA in the New Deal. I love thinking about this as a moment in our history because the agenda of the New Deal was bring the country out of this Great Depression, put people back to work. There's this mass unemployment. It would have been a totally adequate response from one perspective to put unemployed artists back to work building roads and bridges and doing the infrastructure projects that we think of as the WPA. Mostly, I think of them that way because we still see the plaques, the shields in the sidewalks and in the park houses and things that say, built by the Works Progress Administration. But that's not the approach they took. A few prominent artists and arts administrators started these federal arts projects because they said, no, we need to put these artists and musicians and writers back to work as artists because their voice is critical to the health of this society. And we can't sort of climb out of this hole as a country without having an artistic voice present, active, a cultural life sort of be resurrected. Some of the iconic work that came out of that time was the murals, the Diego Rivera murals, the murals that sometimes are still in the post offices and federal buildings and things. But, and there were public sculptures and things. There were WPA orchestras that played in school gyms, often employing the same musicians who had jobs in the professional symphonies that had cut their seasons or something. So these WPA orchestras brought musicians back into work. But then there were the studio artists like Jacob Lawrence and the Migration series of small paintings. Jacob Lawrence, African-American painter, wanted to do murals, didn't get the mural commissions, but he did get the stipends to be a studio artist, and so he made the Migration series as a set of panels that he viewed as one large work. A very Deweyan kind of moment in that work, and Steve was telling me about the show at MoMA. If you haven't seen the Migration paintings, you need to. But in that Deweyan sense of the artist capturing some truth and promoting it to others, the Migration series is a depiction of African-American migration from the South to the North in the first half of the 20th century. It's autobiographical in one sense, historical in another sense, but speaking the kind of truths of the emotional lives, the complexities of those moments that only an artist could represent. The New Deal programs wound down with the war effort in World War II, but echoes of that philosophy persisted. JFK, in a wonderful speech in 1963, actually a month before his death, talked about the role of the artist in American society, and now there's a different kind of socio-political moment, right? There's this height of the Cold War, and there's this sense of, what is the nationalistic impulse, or what is the pride we can feel and create as a nation through our artists. But I think there was something more profound, not just the sort of nationalistic sentiment that JFK talked about. And this is a quote. He said, "If sometimes our great artists have been the most critical of our society, it's because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. I see little of more importance to the future of our country and our civilization than full recognition of the place of the artist." So in my work in Community Music Works, I've been motivated by this question, this notion that by including young people, especially young people in our case from disinvested communities or urban communities who otherwise don't have arts training access in their schools, unfortunately, or out of school, is a training in music with an ensemble of professional musicians, with an ongoing after-school effort, enough to give young people the confidence and the voice to feel like full citizens, full participants, fully empowered to realize their own agendas. And I think when I set out, I thought that would be more automatic than it is. And I think the answer is it's not automatic. I think that it's critical that we, as educators, are critical of how we teach. If our agenda is really to give people, young people, a sense of voice, it's not enough just to say, music is a form of expression. Kids will be able to express themselves with this thing. I remember a talk a few years ago where someone who had been in a community arts tradition and a practicing artist stood up and vehemently said, these kids we're not training them to be artists. We're teaching them craft. But being an artist is something entirely different. It's inappropriate to say that we're creating young artists. Being an artist involves being critical, being aware of what you have to say, finding a way to communicate that. And I found that problematic when he said that, but I think there's an element of truth to this. So one of the important influences for me in thinking critically about how we teach, not only what we teach, has been Paulo Freire. And many of you may be familiar with the work of Paulo Freire, but the classic text is Pedagogy of the Oppressed from about 1970. And he wrote this book having been an education minister in Brazil and working on projects to increase adult literacy, particularly in rural communities in Brazil, so that farmers and other workers in these rural communities would be politically empowered, could come to some sort of political function and represent their own interests. And so Freire was designing these education programs for adult literacy and realized it was really problematic because the goal of the program was to empower these people to have a stronger voice, but the method of teaching was authoritarian and reinforcing the problematic identity rules that he was trying to undo. So the readers themselves, that gave examples, that taught people how to read, were full of examples that had nothing to do with these people's lives or conditions. The methodology of the authority of being the teacher, standing up in front of the room and offering knowledge to the presumably empty vessels of the students who came in without any of their own experience or knowledge, he said, this is just reinforcing this idea that I know nothing, I am nothing, and I'm here to gain from the authority figure. So he really challenged in this book to say, if the goal is, as Maxine talks about, emancipatory pedagogy, education for some kind of greater freedom, we have to think about this idea of authority, and we have to have students and teachers feel more like colleagues coming to a learning experience together, recognizing each other as being full of potential, full of wisdom, and recognizing that the true educational experience can be a mutual exploration of the subject. In music education, I found that to be hard. I approach a violin lesson, having a great number of years under my belt, studying the technique of playing the instrument, studying the harmony, studying the repertoire, and to come in and say, this is a level playing field where, in fact, this young person knows none of these things that I'd like to teach them. How do we make this dialogical, as Freire advocates? How do we make this learning through a dialogue about our collective knowledge, our respective perspectives? And it's possible. It's more about methodology it's more about, I would say, perspective than methodology. There's a way we can view our students as being co-creators, co-learners in a process. Freire says, education as the practice of freedom, as opposed to education as the practice of domination, denies that a man or woman is abstract, isolated, independent, and unattached to the world. It also denies that the world exists as a reality apart from people. I hadn't planned on going into specifics, but this can be one of our prompts. How do we teach music in a Freirean way? So I'll leave that hanging a little bit today, if you permit me. The piece of, back to voice, the piece of young people developing a voice through music education, through music participation, I think, is this combination. It's this combination of what Maxine Greene says. Can we bring the multiple perspectives that we have, that our young people have, into arts learning? Can we think about the process of education as a mutual discovery and respect for the individuality of a lot of different voices? And can these things be, in a sense, a practice of the collaboration, a practice of the democratic values that we would hope for in an evolving democratic society? And there's a second piece, and that is, if people are able to develop multiple perspectives, multiple individualities, do we have the capacity to regard one another with tolerance, with respect, with regard for difference? And back to Maxine Greene, we had a symposium in Providence a few years ago called Music and Civil Society. And for that, I interviewed Maxine Greene about her perspectives, and she said the key to civil society and to being a citizen is having a capacity to regard other. And it's not that, and then she riffed a little bit of music, and she said, "Do you like Lady Gaga?" And I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Wasn't sure where she was going. And she said, well, because I think she was humoring me. She was trying to give a music world example to her point. But she said, because I don't. In fact, I can't stand her outfits. But that's okay, because in a democracy, we make room for the Lady Gagas. And I may be an admirer of Lady Gaga. You may too. That's sort of beside the point. But her point was the way we develop a civil society, the way we develop a society where we have multiplicity, where people are coming from a number of different perspectives, and we can deal with that. We can recognize difference. We can appreciate that there is difference, and that's what makes the fabric of a successful pluralistic society, is that we can regard other as having integrity and have the kind of practice of saying, I can tolerate that we're different, but I can still see you as human. I'm going to close with another Maxine Greene quote having to do with democracy depending on encouraging voices, especially in the arts. She says, pluralities of persons can be helped to go in search of their own images, their own visions of things. Through carving, painting, dancing, singing, or writing, they can be enabled to realize that one way of finding out what they are seeing, feeling, and imagining is to transmute it into some kind of content and to give that content form. Pluralities of persons can be helped to go in search of their own images, their own visions of things. So the questions are voice, regard. Is the work we do developing young people's voice? Is the work we do in music, in training young people in music, enabling them to have a form of expression, a way of really tapping into their individuality, developing an individual voice? But do we mean it? Is this more than saying this is the correct way to play this phrase, which rubs up against that Freirean idea? Am I just telling you the correct way to play music, or are we really digging into this together? Are we really enabling you to find your voice through this medium? And then can we have a practice of democracy going on where it's not only about you can identify your wishes in your voice, but we can begin to live with respect and regard for one another. Thank you so much. I look forward to our questions and discussion over the next couple of days.